You know, I am a retired minister. I've done this kind of thing before, but boy, is it hard in retirement to squeeze so much into so few days. I see a few nods from some fellow retirees there. Well, when I agreed to talk about hard or difficult sayings or teachings of Jesus, I think I said this last week for those of you who were here. I knew immediately that I had this wonderful book by a former New Testament professor, John Carroll, and it was called Preaching the Hard Sayings of Jesus. And I thought, wow, I have got it made. All I'm going to have to do is go through and pick out and see what John says about them all. John had almost no sayings from Matthew in there. Boy, what a bummer. So then I had to really get to work. And I have, as you see, I have actually only 3 passages on the chart here. That's not all that are difficult. But the thing is, what is a difficult passage? What is a hard passage of Jesus? When we say that, what do we mean? Why would we consider something Jesus says as hard or difficult? What it is about it that makes it that way? Anybody venture a guess or an idea?
It's demanding of us.
Oh, wow. How about that? Can you imagine that Jesus is going to demand some things of us when we read Scripture?
And then Keith exaggerates it when he preaches on it. Oh, I didn't realize you were here. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Eric.
It is hard to imagine Jesus saying it sometimes compared to other things he said.
Very, very true. Very true. Well, as you can see, I put a couple of ideas up there. When I thought about it, I thought, well, for me, what makes it hard? Well, sometimes it's just simply, I don't quite understand what Jesus is trying to get at. Now, it's not that he's using theological terms or abstract concepts and things like that that are just so out of my range, but as one of the things that bothers me most about some of the passages, and it's exactly what Bob was getting at, sometimes Jesus says things, and we're going to see it in some of these tonight, that I think, hey, is this the Jesus that I know about or have read about? Is this the Jesus who said one thing and now it seems as if he's saying something totally different here? And that really does make it hard. Now, to go along with what Eric said, sometimes it's just simply hard because we don't want to do it. It requires something of us that we simply do not want to do, and that we really think, surely Jesus is not asking me to do that. And we're going to see, I think, some of that also. Practically, I think there's some things that he says that are hyperbole. We know that Jesus liked to use that, just as he liked to, let's say he liked to use stories. We heard some wonderful things last week about the parables that Jesus used. And we know that he liked to do that. He liked to make comparisons. So maybe that is the problem. But how do we see if that applies to us? I want to quote Amy Jill Levine, who Mary talked about last week. She also has a book called Difficult Words. She only had 2 in there from Matthew. I'll tell you, I don't know why these people that I was relying on just didn't come through for me. But one of the things that she says about when we read these passages that seem difficult is the first thing we need to do is to try to see what did it mean to the people in his time, or the people to whom he was talking, or about whom he was talking. What was the Jewish setting? She goes on to say something that I didn't quite agree with. She said, that's more important than trying to apply it. Well, I sometimes think, well, that's going to be interesting for us to know that this happened and that it was like this. But we don't read the scriptures just for the history of it, or to find out what it was like sociologically or religiously. At least we don't when we're reading about Jesus. Don't we all feel like he's saying something to us, or aren't we supposed to feel? Maybe we may not feel like he is, and we may not in some of these. But isn't that our feeling that if we are a people of faith, then we need to listen to Jesus, because something that he says should impact us. And sometimes that's where the rub comes in. That's where it gets really, really hard. And then occasionally something that Jesus says, and I is maybe even a little contrary to what we have as doctrine, you know. I don't think although I contemplated it, doing one of the sayings where he particularly in Matthew 25, where he talks about if you didn't do this and you didn't do this, you know, you're going to burn in hell. He didn't, but you know, you'll be thrust out. And you know, I've sort of been a believer that it's by grace we are saved, and not by works. So, see, those are the kinds of things that do bother me. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the background that I've found out about. And also, I have two brief descriptions of Matthew's Gospel that come from commentators, and I really thought this was very interesting. Thomas Long, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with him, calls this a first aid manual for this church in the midst of struggle. A first aid manual. Now, that does go back perhaps in some ways to what Amy Jill Levine was trying to say, that if this was directed to specific people and specific congregations, and that maybe this was supposed to be ways for them to try to learn how to live in the society in which and the history that was going on around them, the circumstances in which they were. Now, Paul Minier has an interesting one. He calls it, this is the teacher's gospel. Now, all of us who have been teachers at one time or another, and probably an awful lot of you have been Sunday school teachers, maybe everybody, maybe that's an interesting concept, that it was written by a teacher, considering the author who was a teacher, for teachers, for those in the church who were teaching, who were going out, and it was directed at them. And I think some of the sayings that are teachings that we'll look at, one in particular, I think we might be able to see that is what Jesus is trying to do. He's saying, if you're going to be a teacher, then if you're going out, then here are things that you need to know, that you need to remember. Well, we know that, or at least all commentators that I have read, and I think we've said this last week, that Matthew was considered the Jewish gospel, the gospel for Jews. And I remember when I first heard that or read that, the reason given was the fact that supposedly, and I didn't do the counting myself, but supposedly Matthew quotes Hebrew scriptures more than any of the other gospel writers. Also, most of the commentators felt that the congregation to whom he was writing were made up primarily of Jews. Now, I found differing opinions about why these Jews were, somewhat differing opinions, that why they were gathered. One is that they left the synagogue, or had even been thrown out of the synagogue because they had decided to follow Jesus, and therefore were not considered Jews at all. Another idea was that they wanted to be faithful to Jesus in a difficult and changing world, and that they were, because they had chosen to follow Jesus, then they were trying then to see how what Jesus taught could be incorporated with what they already believed and what their faith had been. And that one of them said that the question that's addressed in Matthew is how to incorporate Jewish customs and legacy into the Christian faith. So we can keep those things in mind as we begin to study. Paul Minier said the community were considered traitors to Israel because they accepted Gentiles and tax collectors and harlots. So, which would be a reason, of course, that they were thrown out of the synagogue or were being even ostracized and criticized by those in the synagogue. Let's go to our first passage, which is in Matthew 5, and this one, of course, still is a part of the Sermon on the Mount. I have more than one translation. I don't know about anybody else, but that is one of my favorite things to do when I am studying. The NRSV, and some of you probably also have a Common English Bible. It's a CEB, newer than, let's see. It came out sometime in the 90s, and because I remember going to a conference where it was still not have published, but it was being talked about, and one of the contributors to it gave a presentation on it. But it's very similar to the NRSV, and but I like to look at both of them. So let's look at Matthew 5, 38 through 48, and I will be reading from the NRSV, but I might also share something from one of the other two that I brought. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. I want to stop right there for just a few minutes. An eye for an eye. We have heard that so many times, haven't we? And people today still will quote that. If somebody did, I think particularly we hear it as far as murder is concerned, a homicide. If they've killed somebody else, then they deserve to die. That, period. From what I have read, and I beg to be corrected if somebody else knows a little differently, but that when it was established in Judaism that an eye for an eye was appropriate, it was to keep people from doing something even worse to someone. If someone puts your eye out, well, you're allowed to put their eye out, but you're not allowed to kill them, for instance. That it was supposed to be equal justice in a sense. Now, here Jesus, of course, is saying that you have to go beyond that. You have to not resist an evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other one to him. Now, one of the things I read was very interesting was that if you were going to strike someone, you did it like this, so that you could come back and then do it the other side with the back of your hand if you needed to. but it was just considered that was equal justice. If you did something terrible, then sure, you deserve to have the same thing done to you. Now, one of the things that was very interesting that I read was that if a rich man, for instance, had his eye put out by a poor man, then what he had to, let me get it right. If a poor man put a rich man's eye out, then the rich man had to recompense him because if he put the poor man's eye out, he also was going to have to give him money, because for the rich man to lose his eye it was terrible, but it didn't affect his income. If a poor man had his eye put out, it affected his income. I mean, that's just what I learned in one of the sources. But I thought that was rather interesting. Think about let us think about, though, how that would apply today. Does this mean that you can, from what Jesus says, does this mean that you can't defend yourself? Think about that one for a while. Yeah, Connie?
How many kids will tell you, your own kids, well, he hit me first.
Exactly. And not only in your kids, but if you've taught in an elementary school anytime, you better believe you're going to hear that a lot. Yeah.
Do I remember correctly, the freedom riders and the activists, outside agitators, who were trained, that they were trained to be non-resistant? Is that right?
I've heard it, but I don't know. Somebody else can probably.
It's a lot like, King and the people trained the people in terms of nonviolent resistance.
They acted it out.
Yeah. So I mean, there are those who still do believe that today.
The interesting thing, I think, is if somebody hits you on one side, when you turn the other cheek, you're in charge.
Yeah, that's true.
You're not being a victim.
Mm-hmm. And I read several different examples with some of the commentators about how that might work, and that was one of the things that it makes you're no longer the victim if you turn to the other person. Well, I don't know. From a philosophical point of view, maybe that's true. I am not sure that there are a lot of people who feel that way.
But isn't Jesus countercultural anyway?
Oh yes, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
When you said elementary school, I think that's very typical of the sense of justice and all for elementary school children. But we're not elementary school
Exactly.
children. We're supposed to have a little different view of justice than an elementary child. But I think culturally we're just right about 8 years old.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I'm wondering if that, I think I mentioned that I'm also a Eugene Peterson person, although I always read the others first because of, but I think this is the one where he tells you to grow up. At the end of talking about that, let me see if this is not yet. Oh, I do know he says.
It's in 48.
Let's see.
I'll read it for you.
Read it.
In a word, what I'm saying is, grow up. You're kingdom subjects. Now live like it. Live out your God-created identity. Live generously and graciously toward others the way God lives toward you.
That's it. This is the copy of the Message that has no verses in it. I mean, no verses lined out. So, and I should have marked it and I didn't. But yeah, that's but that is true, I think, that it is an immature attitude, but Marilyn said it well. However, I do want to read what Tom Long says about the latter part of this, about the part about giving, if anybody forces you to go a mile, go the second one. If he begs from you, do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. And he said, it boggles the mind, of course, to think about living out this example literally in contemporary society. Imagine a Christian in New York City who got up one morning and decided to do what Jesus says here. He would turn the other cheek, give to every beggar, and to respond to every lawsuit by settling out of court for double the amount. The person would be broke, homeless, and in the emergency room of Bellevue Hospital. So I said there are perhaps some limits and practically to this, but on the other hand, I think probably it is harder for us to do. Yeah, Eric.
I have a different interpretation of this cheek thing. So when I was in college, I pledged in a fraternity. We had pledge paddles. And so I put this verse on, I thought it was an interesting verse, and I put it at the top of my pledge paddle. And it said, if man smiteth thee on the one cheek, turn to him also the other. And all people did was beat me up. I still don't get it.
I didn't get it.
Enough of that.
That's good. Oh, go on with.
Well, I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think that when we try to follow Jesus, people will think we're a fool.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the thing. I don't think any of us want to be a fool. So that's one of the things that makes it hard.
It says that in Leviticus, be a fool for Christ.
And Leviticus.
Great insight,
Thank
author of this. Yeah. All right, continuing, this one I know we are familiar with. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and send rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Can think of several things in there that make that hard. Beginning with loving your enemies.
What is
followed the episode going on in Haiti with missionaries or
Yes,
One of the first things that the group that's based up in Ohio said is pray for these captors that they may be changed in their heart.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
But that's following, that's really following this literally.
Yeah, and what do we think of when we hear the word love? There's different,
Oh, yeah.
and so to pray for your enemies is to love them as God loves them. But I suspect there's also the hurt that this happened. So, and I don't know if you have the right to be angry, but
So my instinct would be to grab hold of them and shake the crap out of them.
yeah, that's right.
And we have such a contentious time. This business of loving your enemies, I try to understand and have compassion for them intermittently when I want to beat them with a stick. But at least I have that conundrum, I have that dilemma that I wouldn't have if I weren't a Christian.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to, it's every time I want to beat somebody with a stick, I'm convicted that I'm supposed to have compassion for these people.
Yeah.
And so it stops me, and I'm grateful for that, but it's, you know, it's not an easy thing.
No,
But I'm glad for it, that I'm not just an unfettered beaver with a stick.
I was also thinking about the fact that, well, remembering actually something that happened when I was a pastor in West Virginia. I lived in Greenboro County, and of course the Greenboro Hotel was not very far from where I lived. And one of my parishioners worked in the business office there. And I knew before she had talked to me about this, just her boss was just awful, so hard to work for and so unfair, she thought. And then I had preached one morning on praying for your enemies, and she came to me afterward and she said, Sally, I want you to tell me how I can pray for so-and-so. And I said, well, Peggy, why don't you pray that he'll be changed? Because I think sometimes that might be the closest we can come to actually praying, God bless my enemy, is just asking maybe a little bit more than we're.
But what did Tevye said when they asked, is there a prayer for the Tsar?
Oh, yeah.
Keep him.
What?
When Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof
Oh, yes.
was
Oh.
asked about praying for the Tsar,
Yeah.
and he said something, keep him
Bless,
far away from us.
bless the Tsar and keep him far from
That's
us.
it. Bless the
Yeah.
Tsar and
Bless
keep
the Tsar
him
and
far
keep him
away
far
from
away.
us. I'll
Yeah.
never forget that line. So there you go.
You know, another thing
Straight
that
from the rabbis.
yeah, that right, exactly. And we again, Connie, you I think brought the idea about loving. Another sermon I preached one time was called "Love is an Action Word," and we tend so much within our culture to speak about love as this warm, fuzzy feeling, and so many times what Jesus is talking about is how you act, and you know, you can. Well, I think sometimes I've had this idea that I can say, you know, I don't like somebody, but I guess I can love them in the biblical sense of the word. So,
Don't
I
you think,
remember our daughter Jamie upset because her sister had hit her. And she said, but it was a hate hit. And that was her,
right,
what's the word I'm looking for? That was how she felt
yeah,
it was.
Yeah.
And we really had nice talks about that.
don't,
It was a hate
don't you
hit.
think the rise in belligerence and violence is because people feel they've been given permission from the highest authority, the highest in the country, who practices that or practice that?
well, that certainly can happen I think very easily.
Rough them up,
Yeah, that it's
gentle.
right. Well, let's continue with the next one, which is Matthew 10, 5 through 11. Now this one, we're on a totally different wavelength here, I think. This is the kind where when I made notes on that passage, I said, what? This is, let me read. The 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of a house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You receive without payment, give without payment. Take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics or sandals or a staff, for laborers deserve their food. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy, and stay there until you leave. As you enter the house, greet it. And if the house is worthy, let your peace come upon him. But if it's not worthy, let your peace return to you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave the town or house of town. Truly I tell you, it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment for that town. Now, there are a couple of issues here. The first one is, well, a whole bunch of them. I think I'm probably going to see if we can concentrate maybe on a couple, just a couple of them. But the first one, the one is that first verse I read. Don't go to the Gentiles, basically. Go only to the Jews. Now, I know we've said that Matthew is writing this, mainly for the Jewish congregation, so that's what scholars feel, and I think it's probably proven in the text that we have here. But this was Jesus that don't we think, is the one who wants all people to know him? That, wants to gather all people. God loves everybody, rich, poor, black, white, etc., etc., etc. So why is he saying that?
Particularly since we're Gentiles.
Yeah, that's right. We, of course, we take great umbrage at that. Anybody have any ideas on that?
Is it possible that this is not really Jesus speaking, but whoever wrote this using Jesus as the mouthpiece to actually state their own spite?
You read the same commentary I did, Olson. No, you just have greater insight than I did. I didn't think about that. But that is one of the theories that I read. Yeah.
Paul said, "For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." I think that's a connection.
That is another common, very good. I'll
And
tell you.
Jesus himself started with his disciples were all Jews. He visited all of them. He made a special trip out, but not spent most of his time. But at the end, he said, "Go into all the world,
Right.
and make disciples, not of all nations, but of all people." I don't know why they translated that nation, because everybody thinks of a nation. There are no
Nation is
Christian
used in
nations.
other passages.
It can't be.
Well, I think it's easier sometimes to go somewhere else than to deal with your neighbors.
That's true.
And so, for a long time, our methods were hydraulic, over an ocean. And that was wonderful, but we got a lot of hunger in Buncombe County. And I think it's sometimes easier to go where we're being the ones bringing the good news rather than living it with our neighbors.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's a very good point. Another one that, I think, Bob, you mentioned something about that Jesus himself was mostly preached to the Jews, so that kind of seemed to make sense there. But another commentator said, and the reason I keep saying this is because I don't want you to think that I thought up all of these, was that it was possible that, as you said, the disciples were all Jewish. They were not accomplished rabbis. They were not well educated. That they would do better if they started out with people they knew. They didn't know customs of the Gentiles. It would be so unfamiliar to them that it was just a practical reason for them to start with the Jews. But it does kind of, when you first read that, at least, it kind of ticked me off a little bit, so to speak. That's,
Sally, was it in Matthew that the crumbs, the woman picked up the crumbs from the table and he rebuked her and she said,
I think that's Luke, isn't it? Am I right in that? The Syrophoenician woman.
but that's when, in a way he started moving out.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. And we do eventually see evidences of that, but and of course, maybe this is a commentary simply on the guy from me on the fact that when we isolate too much of a passage too much from the whole context, that it is it's kind of like the proof texting that we criticize in other people, but I think sometimes I can tend to that myself. Anyone else with any comments on that one? Okay, I want to go to 10:34 through 39. Now here's another one that I read that first verse and I went, what? Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household. Now I want to stop right there because we're going to talk about the rest of that 37 through 39, but let's just stop right there. In my notes I said, wasn't Jesus the Prince of Peace? And here he says that he's not come to bring peace, but to divide even families. Now, isn't that a hard one to take? Luke also has this passage, and he actually says, this is where he says you have to hate your father and mother. And now that really, really grinds on you. I would say Matthew softens it somewhat, but not much, but not much, right? And I don't know. I think I really hate this idea. It's this that he's come to bring a sword to cut through the ties between parent and child, and of course some people might say, well, he was just being realistic when he says a daughter-in-law against a mother-in-law.
Yeah, that would work.
On the other hand, some of us had absolutely wonderful in-laws, and I attest to that myself. I love them dearly. This is just hard to take, isn't it? That following Jesus could bring discord to a family. But I'll bet almost every one of us in here can think of some example, if we don't know it personally, that we have heard of where that has happened.
But isn't it very common when someone follows Christ and a parent doesn't, or any sibling or whatever, is very difficult to be accepted and to accept in return?
It is. It is. Certainly seems to be the case.
I had someone tell me the other day that her sisters thought she was crazy
Oh.
because she was a Christian.
Yes.
Really?
Say that again?
Her sister
Oh.
told her she was crazy.
Uh,
It really hurt her because she has a lot of respect for her sister, but that really hurt.
Well, it's and we, it really does. It happens. It happens, of course, often when the family is of another faith, and the person becomes a Christian. That's creates a lot of problems very often, and sometimes in some cases they have been stricken from the family. I mean, completely. This is a case when my husband and I lived in Wallace, North Carolina, and he knew a man who had been brought up as Jewish, but he had married a Christian, and he told my husband, I think I've read this since that happens, but that his parents had a funeral service for him, and actually I think even had a grave site, because that's how much that they. It probably the same thing happens on the other side too. If someone is in a Christian family and they turn to another faith.
How about Christians and Christians and Protestants?
Okay.
I'm sorry, I meant to say Catholics.
Okay. I thought you were being facetious there. Well, I understand that has happened too. I don't know of any personally know any.
I sure do in our family.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Going back.
It's just, it really, it's not just sad, it's tragic, I think. Connie?
Well, one of the things, I lived in South Louisiana, and all my friends were Catholic except a few Protestants that I knew, Presbyterians. But when I was growing up, the Catholic Church was very stringent on their willingness or whatever to allow any of their parishioners to be involved with the Protestant. I had a very good friend in school, and she was friends with our whole youth group, but she could not come to the church. And she could not, for any reason, you could not go to a wedding, a funeral, nothing. You could not go to a Protestant church. And but eventually, while I was in high school, she was so drawn to what we were doing and how we treated one another and all that sort of thing, that she convinced her parents to let her come to youth group. And within a couple of years, her little brother started coming, and then her parents joined the church too.
Wow.
But that took a lot out of them to figure that out, justify it in their own minds, or I don't know what happened at the church, except I guess they were excommunicated if they said anything to the priest, which I'm sure they did.
Yeah.
And now, since Vatican II, things have really changed. Not totally, but it's not quite that stringent. But if you were, when my daughter got married, she married a Catholic. Both of them did. But anyway, this one had been married before, and but it was in a Protestant church, so they didn't have to get it annulled. But they couldn't have a full mass because she was not Catholic. And the same with my other daughter. They didn't have a full mass. They were married in the Catholic Church, but you couldn't have, because they still have this line about Christians and Protestants.
Could this have another meaning though, instead of saying to cleave a family? This is pretty stark. Could it mean that God has to come first? And sometimes I think we worship our families. We invest so much of ourselves in family that's the priority in our life. It's just as if you can invest so much in church that's a priority in our life. Anything that we invest completely in can become the priority in our life. Could there be some word there that
Well, actually,
God really needs to be first?
there is. It starts with verse 37.
Right.
Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. But that basically is what is being said here, is that you can't let family situations come before God, before Jesus. And now here's where I have known the situation where, for instance, parents who want a child to go into the family business, let's say. I don't remember if that was the exact situation. But anyway, the child decides to be a missionary. Now, they wasn't cut off from the family, but it was really, really difficult because they just couldn't understand why this child, this son, did not want to join the family business and would go off to those heathen countries. And I mean, these were Christians, but still, that was. But he felt that was his calling, that God was calling him to do that, and so that's just one example. I'm sure it does.
Seems like an exaggeration to get our attention,
Mm-hmm.
because for many of us, our family really is the most important thing. And but it doesn't, just to hate your family, to hate anybody, is not consistent with the other teachings of Jesus.
No, that's true, and that is why, as one of the commentators said, that Luke is the one who uses the word hate with this similar passage, but that Matthew softened it and probably came closer to the actual meaning of what is being said. Not, you are not supposed to hate them, but you are supposed to have no other gods before me, so to speak. And you can make a parent or a child or a sibling or a spouse, for that matter, you can put them, that person before what God is wanting you to do. I mean, I'm going to attest to slightly personal experience. It's not nearly, didn't cut me, I wasn't cut off or anything, but after I had, quickly, my husband died in 1990, and 3 years later I went to seminary, and my mother was really not very happy about that, even though she was a devout Christian, because I was going so far to her. I was going to Richmond, Virginia, and that was a far piece from Clinton, South Carolina. Well, but anyway, she got through that. But guess what? I was accepted a call in West Virginia, even farther away, and she was complaining about it to a couple of her friends, and one of them looked at her and said, "Are you wanting Sally not to do what God is calling her to do?" My mother never said anything else about how far away West Virginia was. But that's that's a minor one compared to a lot of the others. But anyway, that is the kind of thing I think that we're talking about here. So it's getting near my time to quit. Anyone have any other comments on any of the things that we have talked about? And you could go through and find some other passages, and some that might be you might find difficult and others wouldn't. I know, as I said, there's one of them that I find somewhat difficult, and I'm not sure that other people do. But I think it has been very productive for me to do this study. I had never focused on that particular segment of a gospel, and I have found it to be very very helpful and interesting, and kind of.
Just a quick question. It's been a while since I looked at the lectionary. Do these show up in the lectionary?
Keith, you can,
Okay. I can't remember. It seems like I did. They do, but
You can't remember because preachers like me avoid them. And
Yeah,
we
right.
do the other
There's
stuff.
more text.
You have several choices, you know.
Yeah, you can take
Yeah,
something
yeah,
different.
that's right. Well, I'm
Always
like,
use
I'm
the
like you,
song.
Connie. I was a lectionary preacher too, but at the moment, other than the fact that I think I obviously must have preached on that love your enemy, since I can remember the incident of someone questioning me
Right,
on it.
right,
Yeah,
yeah.
But, yeah, there are a lot, but there are also, of course, there's some passages that don't appear in the, lectionary, like the one I did yesterday for the Presbyterian women. So,
Yeah.
but it's. I hope that we take seriously what Jesus says, but that we also take it not always literally. And I think probably most of us do not. That we recognize that Jesus did speak sometimes in hyperbole with exaggeration or using the examples that are or seem extreme to us. Now, I'm going to venture one more thing that I read, and I'm pondering it, and I will let you ponder it. And it was that Jesus was human. And it quoted the fact that Luke says Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and people. And that maybe some of what Jesus may have said, or at least earlier in the ministry, this was part of a growing experience that he learned. The incident with the Syrophoenician woman is one of those that is used for that. You may not want to to accept that. I've sort of come to, over the many years that I've been studying, that I believe Jesus was without sin, but I don't believe he didn't make. No, I believe he may have made mistakes sometimes. In other words, I even said one time, I wonder if he always took the trash out when Mary told him to. But it's a part of, according to someone else that I was reading, but that this was a part of, it had to be a part of his humanity if he was going to truly understand us. Now, you can, as I said, I'm not giving you that as gospel. You may disagree, and that's fine. I have no problem with that. But just, you might want to ponder that when you come across one of these kinds of things. So, yeah, Connie.
One other quick thing. I was just thinking about verses in the last one, verses 37 and 39. Whoever loves father, mother, and all that. But he is, we just heard about sending people out to the lost folks of Israel, So, this is, it may be a big exaggeration, but what he's saying in all of this is to put me first if you're really going to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a very different thing, countercultural kind of thing in that time, because you said in the beginning, and we need to always think about it, who was he talking to then, and how did they understand things? So, so what, how does he make a point that this is a real demand on you? This is a real serious commitment here, and I don't know.
I never heard of anybody cutting off the hand and foot and gouging out the eye,
No.
even in the early church. I don't think
No.
there was a cynicism.
I don't think so either.
That seems so obvious, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's true. And also, talking about familial relationships, we have to remember that a couple of times it seemed that Jesus was pretty sharp to his mother.
Mm-hmm.
When he, she and the brothers and sisters too, maybe, anyway, they came because they really had decided that Jesus was crazy, that he needed to be, when he said, my mother is everyone who follows me, or something. I can't remember the exact quote, but so that's, he's even then, and yet we know at the end of his life how how he still thought of his mother at the cross. But that doesn't mean that when she wanted him to do something that he did not feel was right, or when, to stay home, or, this kind of thing, that he himself had to separate himself. So, okay, Keith, you have any?
We will close with a prayer, but first of all, thank you, Sally Woodard. Great discussion.